Hello everyone, welcome to another lecture of gender studies. In this lecture we will study about the difference between gender studies and women studies. Let's start this lecture now. First of all, basic difference between gender studies and women studies. Before going to study the difference between gender studies and women studies, one by one we will study a common and general difference between both the subjects. So keep in mind that in gender studies we study all the genders, not only women. On the other hand, women studies is based on only women. Just keep in mind that under gender studies we study all the genders including male, female, gay, lesbian, trans, bi, etc. But under women studies we remain focused on only one gender, that is women. So this is basically general and a common difference between gender studies and women studies. Now we will move ahead and we will study the difference between gender studies and women studies one by one. Here is the first difference. Gender studies begins from the critical position established by women's studies in order to look more broadly at gender as a phenomena. This complement basically makes the difference that women's studies is basically an older subject than the gender studies and maintains the fact that gender studies basically established on the basis of women studies. Women studies was developed from women liberation movements which were focused on providing women equal rights with men. They were intending to provide women equal opportunity in political, economical and other affairs. So the subject women studies came into being during 1970s, as we have already studied in our previous lecture. After studying the women studies, feminists and scholars of that particular time wanted to study gender in a broader way to know about other genders as well, like gays, trans, genders, bi and others. In this way the gender studies came into being existence. Just remember that gender studies came into being existence on the basis of women studies. So women studies is an older subject than gender studies. Second difference. Gender studies is more inclusive than women's studies, whereas women's studies focus merely on women and their issues. This difference basically maintains the fact that women's studies is based on study of women only, whereas under gender studies we study all the genders including men, women, gays, lesbian, bi, etc. Third difference between gender studies and women studies is based on theoretical difference between both of them. Women's studies revolves around feminist theory, whereas gender studies is more universal in scope because of its theoretical foundations. Gender studies is based on a number of theories including psychological, constructivist, critical study of masculinity, queer studies, LGBT rights and their critical races, ecological feminism, materialistic feminism and others. So just keep in mind that women's studies is based on only feminist theory, whereas the gender studies is based on multiple theories as we have mentioned. Fourth difference. Gender studies is multidisciplinary, whereas women's studies is interdisciplinary. Now what do we mean by multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary? Women's studies as an interdisciplinary means that women's studies revolves around social sciences, arts and humanities. It means that it does not cross the circle of social sciences. Whatever it is, it remains within the circle of social science only. On the other hand, multidisciplinary gender studies means that it crosses the boundary of its own discipline and goes to different disciplines like economic, biology and others. We study gender not only in the domain of social science, but we study gender in the broader perspective by studying its various aspects in other disciplines. So we can see that gender studies is basically a subject of social science, but when we study the body structure of a gender, then it goes under umbrella of biology, which is basically a subject of natural science. So in this way, we say that gender studies is multidisciplinary in nature and women studies is interdisciplinary in nature, and hence this is the difference between both of them. Fifth difference. Foundation of gender studies is based on consciousness raising, that how we can raise the consciousness of people, how can we aware people about different genders. On the other hand, there is no strong focus on raising consciousness of students in women's studies, as under this subject we focus on only women's studies instead of all the genders. So this thing draws another difference between both the subjects. Sixth difference. There is no activism of feminist in gender studies, as gender studies is not based on women only. On the other hand, there is feminist activism in women's studies. Although there is activism of various genders in gender studies, but there is not only the activism of a feminist there like it is in women studies. So these were the differences between gender studies and women's studies. Keep in mind that women's studies consider the woman history and gender studies considers the men role in the woman history. Similarly, women's studies initiates the analysis at women literature, and gender studies draws attention towards the role of men in articulation and even creating it. Women's studies pondered upon the women's studies and women's struggle for freedom so that the issues could meet the debate desk as soon as possible, whereas gender studies is the paradigm shift. Gender studies basically started from women's studies, as we have mentioned above that women's studies is an older subject than the gender studies. So this was all about the difference between gender studies and women's studies. This is all from today's lectures. Lectures on gender studies will be continued in the coming videos. Thanks for watching this video. Like, share, subscribe, and don't forget to press the bell icon for more videos. Goodbye.